Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show, bringing a really fascinating guest today involved in creating a better tomorrow. Today, we have the honor of being joined on the show by Dr. Alycia Halladay, who is the Chief Science Officer at the Autism Science Foundation. This is a nonprofit organization. They're dedicated to supporting people with autism and their families by funding a range of scientific research to understand the causes of autism, ultimately to help develop better treatments and to enable individuals with autism to lead fulfilling lives with dignity. Dr. Halliday oversees various areas, including scientific activities, grants, and other initiatives, ASF, and she produces also a weekly podcast that's aimed at specifically explaining scientific information to the public. Prior to joining the Autism Science Foundation, Dr. Halliday served as Senior Director of Clinical and Environmental Sciences at Autism Speaks, another major autism organization. Dr. Halliday has authored dozens of peer-reviewed papers in the literature, serves also on the board of directors for the Phelan McDermid Syndrome Foundation, as well as the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee. She did her Ph.D. in Biopsychology at Rutgers, go Scarlet Knights, and went on to do a postdoc fellowship in Pharmacology and Toxicology at UMNTNJ, and is in the editorial board of both Neurotoxicology and Frontiers in Pediatrics, and she also still holds a faculty appointment at Rutgers. A lot to get into today. Very honored to have her with us. Dr. Alycia Halladay, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for that wonderful introduction as well.
Thank you for doing all those things. It's yeah, I'm really looking forward to this discussion and getting into a range of topics. Would love to start off, sort of at the beginning, back at Rutgers. I had a glance at your PhD, which was quite interesting. Where you were studying the enhancement and the depletion of dopamine signaling, and specifically this family, these ephren tyrosine kinase receptors that I actually had some experience with back in the day, and sort of their involvement in the development of the brain and cell migration and stuff like that. Would love to hear sort of about the early days of your work in this area, and then we'll move forward from there. But a very cool start, let's put it that way.
Yeah, it kind of was. So I actually started my graduate school career interested in neurotoxicology, right? So I was studying amphetamine toxicity, and I was studying fenfluramine toxicity and all these other toxic substances that are known to affect brain development. As it so happened, we were then looking at the effects of these toxicants on cell migration and cell-to-cell signaling, which we now know is really important for autism. At the time, we didn't, but we were just looking. It was really kind of newer research looking at how cells connected to each other in the brain and what signals were sent from each neuron to make sure that they connected properly. I started graduate school in 1995. In 1999, a study came out that linked potentially different toxin exposures, specifically ethyl mercury in vaccines, to autism. And so I became involved in a project that looked at, specifically, this is 1999, so it looked at the phenomenon of regression around the time that the vaccine was administered. So there was multiple parts to this study. It was one of these new program grants that was offered by NIEHS and EPA. And I was lucky to be a part of it, looking at the animal model side. So we were looking at different toxicants, including thimerosal, on how it affected brain development, and then also how it was affecting behavior, and how animal models of autism, what they look like. They look a lot different now than they did in 1999. That's okay. That's science. That's progress. And then it also included an epidemiological component where people went into staff went into people's houses and collected things like water and dust and air samples, and tried to look at that critical period that we thought at the time was that time of regression, which we now know is actually about the time when some of the behavioral features start to be seen. So I think since then, the vaccine theory has been kind of disqualified or dispelled, at least scientifically it has. But the role of different environmental factors and how they work with genetics, I think, is still a very active area of research, or at least it should be. So we know that the rise in prevalence, a lot of it is because of better awareness, changes in diagnostic practice. But there's some that we don't know what it is. We know it's not vaccines, but there could be other environmental factors. And in fact, those environmental factors, research has suffered because we've been focusing so much on the role of vaccines in autism. And maybe that was necessary based on the preliminary study, and we had to follow the science, but the science was clear, and so we need to move on from that. So that's how I got started. And then I decided at some point, I kind of got introduced to the role of nonprofits, and I started working at the National Alliance for Autism Research, which then became Autism Speaks. And then in 2014, 10 years ago, I left Autism Speaks and joined the Autism Science Foundation.
Excellent. Excellent. And yeah, and again, I've watched you give several presentations and lectures on this, and I apologize asking, but I think this is just another way we have to lay sort of the groundwork here for the audience. Let's just talk a little bit about what we're talking about when we're talking about autism. When we talk about the term the autism spectrum disorder, I watched you recently on a show talking about something called profound autism, where I guess this is a new sort of classification. I mean, it might not be the DSM yet, but in the DSM, we have these different levels of classification of patients on different levels of the support they require. Talk a little bit about what we're talking about when we mean autism and the spectrum disorder, and just a little bit about prevalence, where we have this figure of 4 times more likely to affect boys than girls. Take us into some of the data, and then we'll get into a little bit of the different research that you're focused on.
Yeah, this issue of the broad spectrum of autism is something that, from a research perspective, is very frustrating, right? From a scientific and research perspective. From a community perspective, we believe that, we should be inclusive, right? So we should say, if you have some of the core features of autism, which includes impairment in social communication, and then presence of restrictive and repetitive behaviors, and those can include sensory issues, they could include things that are, as benign as hand flapping or circling, or as severe as self-injury and aggression. But at the core of those, there can be a broad spectrum of those. So there are individuals with autism. One wrote an op-ed today in the New York Times about how he was diagnosed at 63. He's the editor of Science. He's a professor. So he lives independently. He has autism, but then there's also types of autism like friends of mine, their children have, where they are unable to communicate, they have severe intellectual disability, they cannot be left alone for even 15 minutes because of safety concerns. Things like aggression and self-injury, wandering are really, really, really important issues in their lives. But yet we have all of this under one umbrella. And so from a community perspective, making sure everyone is included and receives the right services and supports, that's one thing. From a science perspective, making sure that everyone has the right services and supports and the recognition of what those needs are is a different thing. And so I think that there's been a little bit of tension in the community to say, what is right for this person may or may not be right for everyone. So having that freedom to choose everything from like, what is an appropriate living situation, right? So do people need what is community living, and what is a quote unquote institution, right? So certain living situations may not be appropriate for some people, but they may be completely appropriate from other people. The same with vocational opportunities. So some people think that there are some jobs that are inappropriate for people with autism, right? So like what is considered, labor or unskilled labor, that's obviously not the same. I mean, obviously an employment opportunity for someone like the editor-in-chief of science is going to be a lot different than, say, the opportunity for someone who has an intellectual disability.
Sure.
So the idea behind the label of profound autism is that we're just recognizing that the spectrum is broad. This
Right.
used to occur with the previous DSM, which is like the manual of how autism is diagnosed, in terms of specific labels. So there was everything from autistic disorder to PDD NOS to Asperger's that would classify those things. They were kind of condensed into the autism spectrum disorder label because it was noticed that on a state to state level, some of the services that were appropriate, or the services that were offered to people with Asperger's in one state were not in another state, and there was some inequity, and that was a attempt at rectifying that inequity. What has been an unintended result is that this spectrum of autism has just been this huge entity that doesn't necessarily recognize the strengths and challenges of individuals with autism. And that's the purpose of the profound label, is to say there are individuals that in fact have an intellectual disability who are minimally verbal or nonverbal, who require 24/7 support. These are
Mhm.
individuals that probably will never live independently or even semi-independently, that are always going to require probably 24/7 care. It's not it's not a better than or worse than. It's a distinction to make sure that everyone's needs across the spectrum are met. So I know that it's been somewhat of a contentious topic. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be a point of clarity and
Sure.
transparency.
Perfect. Perfect.
But
Um,
that's been a struggle for researchers for a while, as the prevalence has gone up and we've recognized individuals that may have a late diagnosis or who have may flown under the radar for a while, that no two people, that this is compounding the problems in research to make
sure.
sure that everybody gets the right level of support.
Hmm. Hmm. And as you know, we'll be getting into, and no doubt you and the network that you support are learning that there's probably dozen, just say when we talk about things like genetics, we're finding dozens of potential genetic and epigenetic connections. And yeah, there's probably lots of different subcategories. But no, I appreciate you, sort of laying that groundwork. So that's great. Listen, think I'd like to do, because as I mentioned, you published quite a bit on a wide range of areas, and I thought we could take a little time and walk through sort of where we are in 2025 in each of these categories, because there's so many aspects of how one goes about studying this group of disorders. And I thought just an interesting place, we're just talking about, would be sort of the genetics slash epigenetics and what we understand of this today. I know going back, I think one of the first papers that you published in the area back in 2006 was on this interesting neurobehavioral model of autism involving sodium valproate, and sort of in that paper sort of include we need some better models. And a couple of years later in Neurotoxicology Journal 2009, which there was an annual neurotox meeting again talking about, hey, we got to get better genetic models, better understanding here. Where are we? I mean, we talk obviously a lot about the genome and genetics on this show related to cancer, rare disease.
Yeah.
I took a look at some of sort of what's out there in terms of existing genetic targets, and there's some. I mean, not hundreds, but things that affect how neurotransmitters work and how nerve cells communicate and connect and so forth. What do we know in 2025 as some of the key genetic drivers of this set of disorders?
Yeah, when I first started working at NAR all those years ago, researchers were looking for the gene, right? So
Mm-hmm.
they were putting together these huge data sets of all these people with autism who had, which they've gotten bigger since then. But
Right.
at the time, there were tens of thousands of people. They were looking for the gene. They thought there was going
Right.
to be a gene, right? Well, out of that research, it's emerged that there are hundreds of genes and probably thousands, right? So there's
Yeah.
hundreds which are called syndromic or rare genetic disorders. So these are genetic disorders that are things like Fragile X, Angelman syndrome, Phelan McDermid syndrome. These are conditions which have their own name and have a known genetic cause with a high prevalence of autism. So we know that they are involved. There are also probably thousands of genes that have like smaller mutations or common mutations that are involved in autism. So it's because it's such a broad spectrum, we can't possibly, you know, assume that there's going to be one gene anymore. We know
Right.
we've done the research, we've made advances, but we do know that there's about 100 or so, probably more, right? I talk to families every day who get a genetic report and there's a variant. And as it turns out, this can explain their child's or their own autism, right? So these genes have a common element, though. The genes seem to all be involved somehow in how cells in the brain connect with each other. So whether or not they're involved in how cells kind of grow and expand and have these like trees that I call, they're leaves on a tree that start to
Right.
touch each other, and it's how the brain cells connect with each other. So how they grow, how they actually connect. So how one cell connects to another cell, whether that's adhesion or repulsion, how they make those right connections in the brain. So they seem to have that common underlying factor. Um, and this common underlying factor has kind of driven the field to say, there's this imbalance, right? So there's cell signals or pathways that are turned on too much. There's other pathways that aren't turned on enough. And in between those, there may be these stop signals or these traffic lights that help other brain connections kind of make sense of it all.
Hmm.
So we're still working on what exactly goes on in the brains of people with autism, right? And that's why studies that actually use brain tissue of those with autism through the Autism Brain Net are so important,
Right.
because we really need to better study that. But at the same time, there's not going to be one gene. There's a set of genes which may be different in each person. Some of them may have different effects than others, and then they're going to interact with different environmental factors. And when we talk about environment, we want to think broadly. We don't
Right.
want to think just about what people think of, vaccines or even toxicants
Yep.
or medications. We want to think broadly in terms of contextual factors, right? We want to think broadly in terms of things that are environmental, that affect the way that the brain develops, the way that we interact with the world. These can be things like, neighborhood factors, socioeconomic factors, educational levels, educational opportunities, opportunities for intervention, the intervention themselves. So there's a whole lot of things. And that's why we're so optimistic about the role of interventions, right? Is because
Right.
early interventions can help mold those connections. And we're not trying to change who an autistic person is. We're trying to allow someone who has these kind of early markers of autism to be able to do things like communicate, or have some cognitive thought so that they can live independently and that we're not constantly worried about safety. So, I think that's where we also get tied up in the autism community is what is the role of this research and what's the role of its impact on the autism community. And the role
Right.
is not to eliminate autism. The role is to make a better life for the people that have an autism diagnosis.
Hmm. Hmm. But coming back to that, to make a better life, requires requires the work you're doing and sort of the detailed understanding of all these differences at the genetic level. And then, as you were mentioning before, when you mentioned BrainNet, which I think is quite fascinating because you it was in 20 about 10 years ago in 2016, you published this piece on sort of the state of the epigenetic research. So,
Mm-hmm.
we talk about genes. We have this now increased understanding of the epigenetic architecture that is, whatever we're talking about cancer, we're talking about rare disease that sits on top of that. And again, I took a look at some of these epigenetic changes. And again, as you were mentioning, everything from, energy metabolism of the mitochondria, potassium channels, again, a wide range of things. And you point out in this paper that, look, our understanding here is challenged because there's only so many samples, proper samples that we can take to really understand the heterogeneity that comes into play when we have focus on the epigenetics. And BrainNet is this very important tool that I know you've been involved in sort of putting together networks of, the specialists that can access and really what's medical examiners, pathologists, and so forth. Talk again, take us into sort of where we are at the state of the epigenetics, but also what Autism BrainNet is all about, because I think it's a very important program as part of the the overall programs you're involved in.
Yeah, and if you thought that the conversation about genetics is complicated, well,
Yeah,
you add on another layer to that, which is epigenetics. And
right.
so someone who worked in the field had described this, and there's actually this whole great PBS documentary series about it, that the DNA or the genetics is the piano. The epigenetics is the person playing the piano.
Yep.
So there's music that you can get from the piano, but actually it takes somebody to play the piano. And that's epigenetics. And these are markers on genes that can turn on or turn off a gene or the activity of a gene. And these can be controlled through the environment. So this is a really important kind of crossroads of gene environment interactions, is like where you can take an environmental factor and think of that broadly and influence gene expression, and that can be on the side of the epigenetics. And so there's these different chemical signals that either turn on or turn off and genes through different ways, right? I could talk forever on this. But, in 2016, I think we had limited samples and we still do, right? But through the efforts of things like Spark, there are more genetic samples and more opportunities to investigate some of what these epigenetic markers are. Just like genetics, though, there are multiple different ways that epigenetics works, right? So
Right.
there's everything from, the way that DNA is coiled. If you took your DNA and spread it out, it would go like all your strands of DNA from like here to the moon. So you're a person, you have to compact it somehow. So the way it's compacted is epigenetic. The markers, which turn on or turn off genes through different chemical mechanisms, are epigenetic, and they're controlled through the environment. They're just like genetics. We're just starting to untangle what they are. We have some markers of epigenetic activity. Some of these things overlap with things like cancer, that you mentioned looking at the genetics of cancer, the epigenetics of cancer. Some of them overlap, some of them are distinct, some of them are specific to autism, and some of them are broader in terms of things like schizophrenia and bipolar and ADHD, and obsessive compulsive disorder. So disentangling what's common across different psychiatric issues and then what's specific about autism is of high priority. And it's one of these things that the more samples that are collected and the more research is conducted, and also the technology, right? I mean, I remember when I first started, I mean, just in 20 years, we've gone through from studying genes at a time to be able to look at the whole genome at one time and disentangle every single gene that someone has and where those mutations are, where those variations are. And that was just in the past 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
So the standards of genetic analysis are changing, the same with epigenetic analysis. So, to make matters more complicated, it's genetics, and then there's epigenetics, and then even the genetics, like even if you have a rare genetic mutation, like say in Rett syndrome, that's a
Yep.
epigenetic marker that's affected.
Sure.
So it's like just because it's a rare genetic disorder that affects your DNA, it can also affect you epigenetically. So it's pretty complicated, and I don't want to scare people and make them think that this is unsurmountable. The issue is we need more research in all of these areas.
Yeah, no, and that's that's why I'm bringing up, because I think a lot of the the public would like a simple, oh yeah, here's a cause and here's an effect, right? I mean, I got the flu, I had an influenza virus, but no, it gets much more complicated. And it speaks to the need of a lot, a lot more funding towards this research, but at the same time, the complexity that this set of disorders represents, and I apologize ahead of time, but we're going to add one more level of complexity now. And just as a couple of years ago, I hosted Dr. Latoya Miles on our show, and she was the deputy director of the Air Resources Lab at NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And this thing we refer to nowadays, basically all the food, water, air, all the chemicals, whether they're commercial, occupational, environmental, whatever the case is, there's like a million of them. It's not like a couple, right? There's a lot, and this is now termed like all the omics. This is known as the exposome. You've done work in this area, a very interesting paper from 2016, a systematic review and meta-analysis of multiple airborne pollutants in autism spectrum disorder. Again, I'm not going to ask you what the solution is right now, but what were some of the things you learned? I know some of the takeaways there were that, hey, there's limited evidence when we have a cocktail of all the possible pollutants that one could be exposed to at different times of their childhood or before they're born. What are some of the takeaways at this point in terms of your learnings with regard to the exposome?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't want anyone to think that this is unsurmountable because it's not. But you have the genetics, then you have the epigenetics, and then on top of that, you have the exposome. So the exposome is everything you're exposed to, both chemical, nutritional, toxicological, workplace, sociological, the contextual, all of these different things. And some of these things, right? So some of these things, like you can record what medications you're on, or you can maybe remember, not everybody remembers or knows what medications they're on, believe it or not. They may know that they're taking a medication, but they may not know the medication. Yep. You may not be able to remember everything, or you may not even know, right? So like, how much air pollution am I exposed to? I have no idea. How much phthalate exposure, how much chemical, I don't really know, right? So it's really important to take this from multiple perspectives, and different, believe it or not, different countries and different environments are doing this differently. So in the United States and even abroad, they have these air pollution monitoring stations. So you can take your zip code and say, okay, well, how close I can approximate my air pollution exposure based on my zip code or where I live, even though that's not, maybe during COVID, that's where you were all the time, but maybe it's not where you are all the time. There's other methods in certain countries. Your health records, and we're starting to move in the United States towards this, your health records are tied to your to every single surgery you've ever had, your parents, your grandparents, your siblings, medications that your mother took during pregnancy, medications that you took as a child, medications that also your zip code. So there's ways to integrate them. And then there's self-reports. So then there's things like, okay, as a mother, I remember, I had, I had high blood pressure during my third trimester, or I had gestational diabetes during my second trimester, or something like that. So there's also medical conditions that some people, remember or don't remember. 14, my girls are 14. I don't really remember everything that happened. So there's different ways of trying to prospectively understand and track people across time, especially pregnancies. And then there's other ways to back that up in terms of medical records, self-report, and integrate all those things together into what's known as the exposome. And we know that right now it's imperfect, right? So you can monitor air pollution one way and chemical exposures another way. You can measure contextual factors one way. And part of the recent publication that we wrote was ways for researchers to measure contextual factors through different databases or resources that different countries or different free resources that people have, so that you can also layer that on top. And, it's probably unrealistic to think, I mean, I'm looking towards, these futuristic movies where you take all of this and then say, okay, there's a 100% chance or a 0% chance that my child will have autism, or we're getting better at some of these early behavioral features, right, to predict an autism diagnosis. Is
Mm-hmm.
that possible all the way through pregnancy? Maybe a diagnosis, certainly not the level of specificity in terms of a diagnosis of, say, someone with profound autism versus someone who may be the editor-in-chief of science who has an autism diagnosis. But with some specificity, we're hoping to say, these are some of the likely factors. The thing about some environmental factors, maybe not all of them, is some of them can be changed and they're good for, curbing your air pollution exposure, curbing chemical exposures, curbing toxicant exposures aren't just relevant for autism. They
Right.
are relevant from everything from heart disease to asthma to diabetes. So we're not talking just about autism here when we say, oh, we want to reduce air pollution exposure. We want to improve people's health in general. So I think that when we talk about environmental factors in autism, some of them are broader than just autism. And we're not talking about just reducing them to think about autism probability. We're talking about helping kids and adults, right? Like if you have asthma as a kid, you're probably going to have asthma as an adult. If you have diabetes, that sometimes is hard to change,
Mm-hmm.
depending on what type. So I want people to think about generally improving health and development when we think about
Right.
some of these environmental factors. Access to services, right? Like we want everyone to have access to services. Wouldn't it be great if everyone had access to services? So those are the sorts of things that we want to change.
Excellent. Excellent. And just one other thing I want to ask you while we're on the this topic. You know, I know that you've been involved in some publications looking at the sex and gender differences in ASD, and just again taking a brief glance. There's genes that are specific for males, for females, some that they are shared. I came across this thing, and I don't know if this is sort of accepted or not, and I'd love to just hear. It's called the female protective effect, which I don't know if that's like sort of bound as okay, this is everyone's in agreement with this, but are there things we understand nowadays in terms of not just the genetic differences, but are there a counterbalance things that we can learn from why it's 4-to-1 male versus female, and what do we know in 2025?
Yeah, so the Autism Science Foundation has actually been very active in understanding this female protective effect. We launched
Okay,
one of the first studies to look at it.
cool.
The idea is you're absolutely right. One of the more constant findings in autism research is that there is a higher number of males diagnosed than females. Some people believe, and this could partially be true, that females are underdiagnosed. Different models have said even if they are underdiagnosed and we improve detection of females, right, because they may be more social, so they may be missed, they may have later onset because just males and females are different, right? They have different behavioral challenges, they have different developmental trajectories. I don't want to talk
Hmm.
about, how females are more this and males are more that,
Right.
but that could definitely play into it. There may be a sense that we're not diagnosing females, and we probably aren't. But even if that's true, there's still a higher number of males being diagnosed than females. And so, what can we learn about this? And what is it about females that makes them more resilient to a diagnosis? And can we promote that in some way, right? Can we put that
Hmm.
in a bottle, right? I think everyone wants resilience in a bottle.
Sure.
And I think the two things go hand in hand. I think that if someone is more biologically more social and able to communicate or have greater social development and then also kind of go under the radar in terms of an autism diagnosis, that still may confer a sense of resilience in
Hmm.
autism, right? Now, there may be other challenges there, and I'm not dismissing females and other challenges, right? Females tend to show more things like anxiety and internalizing effects, and I don't want to dismiss that. But there seemed to be something where we're seeing a higher, for lack of a better word, genetic load. So higher genetic variation in females with autism, and in some respects, sisters of girls who are diagnosed. So there's something on this female side that they have a higher genetic load, but yet there's a lower occurrence of autism. So there's something that promotes resilience, a protective mechanism in females that we don't understand yet, but we're just starting to understand it, that may change that may influence why more males than females are diagnosed. There's also the other side to this is that there may be something about males that confers a susceptibility. There may be something biologically about males that make them more susceptible to an autism diagnosis.
Hmm.
Rather than it being a female protective effect, it may be a male sensitization effect. But this bias has been consistent over the years, right? There's always been more males than females diagnosed, and we still don't really understand why. And that we really need to get to that, right? And we could
Hmm.
learn so much about the biology, brain development, everything if we, looked at gender differences.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, I'm going to throw one more wrench in here because it's just
Okay.
interesting, and again, I think it's an important part of the conversation. Um, Last year in November, Journal of Pediatrics Gastroenterology, uh, you published a paper. You were involved in the paper. It was on the conference proceedings for something known as the Consortium for Autism, Neurodevelopmental Disorders, and Digestive Diseases. Talking about it's an advocacy group that's involved in sort of understanding sort of this relationship, specifically the gastrointestinal dysfunction in patients. But it got me thinking about the microbiome, and
Hmm.
it seems like the microbiome pops up everywhere nowadays, and especially sort of this principle of the gut-brain axis. We talked about that in regard to Parkinson's disease. We talked about sort of the oral microbiome and sort of early stage Alzheimer's. What do we know about sort of the extremely complex community of microorganisms that is in our digestive tract and its relation to autism spectrum disorder?
Yeah, and I know this is really important for families because, you go to Whole Foods, for example, and there's whole walls of things called probiotics. Some of them are
Right.
refrigerated, some of them are in capsules. And you go to these places and you're like, I'm having issues with my digestive system. Where do I start? So I think that this is a really important area of research. What we know is that there's definitely differences in the microbiome of people, at least certain people with autism. So if you think about the microbiome, these are like millions, hundreds of millions, even these little microorganisms. And you may think,
Right.
I initially heard about that this is disgusting, but these are the things that help us digest food. These are the things that also even send chemical signals back to the brain. And they can be influenced by what we eat. They can be influenced by genetics. They can be influenced by other environmental factors, influence the microbiome, and they can influence behavior. And so the microbiome is critical, especially in people with GI issues, right? So the GI issues can be anything from like general indigestion to people who are so constipated that they need surgical interventions, right?
Mm.
And they won't eat because they're in such pain. And it's a real issue for people that are nonverbal, right? Because they're very, very hard to diagnose. So, anything to help alleviate some of these problems in people with autism, regardless of the cause, is very welcomed. And while it may seem gross, these microorganisms play a really important role in, as I said, in digestion. Now, is it specific to autism? I think probably not. I think this host of microorganisms in your gut is probably influences a number of different things, not just digestion, but signaling to the brain about everything from feeling full to social behaviors to communication. What we haven't figured out is if it's specific to autism, because there's so many of them out there, right? You look at differences in the microbiome, and the best you can do, because there's these hundreds of millions of organisms, is group them into different categories and say which ones have a higher which categories are are more in autism, and more are impaired in autism. What's the different balance of these different groups? And there's been a lot of different findings in terms of that. So we haven't gotten to the point of saying, okay, it's this group that we need to target. Not yet. We also know that the microbiome, of course, as you would imagine, is heavily influenced by the diet. And
Hmm.
so I think that a lot of studies are looking at that and showing that, dietary preferences for whatever reason, whether it's sensory issues or just taste issues, are different in people, a lot of people with, not everyone. So I know people with autism that eat nothing but fruits and vegetables. I know people with autism that eat nothing but white foods, mashed potatoes and white bread. So I don't think that this is something that's, like you can say, oh, well, if you eat this type of food, you are not going, the symptoms are going to be alleviated. But
Hmm.
I think that you have to really think about the diet. And there's been important publications have shown that the diet is really important. Now, again, I want to mention that diet doesn't necessarily mean that you can treat it just with diet.
Right.
And we know that it's more complex than that, but definitely diet may influence things. Now, how it influences things in different people, because the people that I mentioned, the people that, I know some people who have children who are profoundly affected and they eat lots of different types of different vegetables, and then people who, are retired engineers who live independently who still eat nothing but white food. So again, I think this is where heterogeneity in the features comes into play and how we really need to understand the features of people with autism and then also take into account their other gastrointestinal features, which is highly overlooked. I mean, we know that people with autism have gastrointestinal problems, but we hardly ever integrate that into research studies.
Right.
So that's something that definitely needs to happen. And the same with other physical issues, neurological issues like seizures and epilepsy. I mean, I think that maybe science has looked at, okay, seizures or no seizures, or epilepsy, no epilepsy. But, looking at some of the distinct features, I think that we've been okay at grouping them a little bit, but I think we need to do a better job at some of these, physical comorbidities as well.
Hmm. Hmm. Wonderful. And again, I appreciate Alycia, you laying the groundwork of all of that. And now with that in hand, would love to uh, introduce the ASF at the beginning, but let's go into a little bit of what you're funding currently, because again, it's quite diverse. And again, we will put the link to the website in the bio of the show. But I see everything in here from you know existing FDA approved drugs, repurposing trials, novel drugs, IPS, stem cell, sort of very early stage in vivo and in vitro work. And then next to that, a lot of what you called before the contextual factors in autism research, which you read a really nice paper just a couple of weeks ago that we're not doing enough of that research, but clearly you're funding studies in that area that you allow to do, as you say, the longitudinal autism studies for longer periods of time. Again, take us into ASF and a little bit of the partnerships, how you look at the different grant proposals and what types of stuff you're personally excited about looking forward.
Yeah, we're in a really interesting, I mean, interesting is probably a benign word for the point in time where we are right at this very day in terms of scientific research.
Right.
We have historically funded most of our funding goes to pre and postdoctoral fellows. And
Okay.
it's a combination of, a great new scientist and a great study. So we have rigorous scientific review and we have really invested a lot of money in both the idea of funding the next generation of researchers because we know that's so important and also the science that they conduct, right? So this is really done in partnership because we provide them a stipend, but there's research costs that come with every study. So these in itself are research partnerships with other universities and with other granting agencies that help put a study together. So maybe we support the training of an individual and then other organizations support the actual research itself. So that's been an important component. We, this is becoming a very, very tough issue today because so many early career researchers are losing their funding, right? And so
Yeah.
institutions are losing funding and not able to hire pre and postdoctoral researchers. So we will continue to provide early career training awards. We are thinking strategically about how best we do that right now. But we also fund and are very active in other initiatives as well. Like, for example, the Baby Siblings Research Consortium, which is a
Yeah.
group of scientists that study the very early signs of autism, even from infancy, because they have those infants have an older sibling, so they have a much higher chance of an autism diagnosis. We fund a collaboration of research organizations that focus on rare genetic disorders, right? So they need kind of a neutral party to kind of bring them all together to make sure that they're at least knowing what each other is doing and aligned. What we see our role is actually is to identify understudied areas or things that need to be done in the community and bring it up to a level where, NIH will fund it, another large research organization will fund it, the CDC will fund it. That has been our strategy, to say, we have limited funds. We certainly want to do what we can, but we want to do strategically. So we're funding things that we can fit in partnerships with, right? Like we don't want to take it over. We want to do something that's novel and unique and may bring research dollars to a particular area.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, we're kind of at a delicate period in scientific research right now. And so we're kind of rethinking how that should all be done within autism research. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure I know that other organizations are doing this as well. We also try to bring the community to research as well. So we have a participate in research portal where we invite researchers to post things on this portal, and then we invite people to come in and put in search terms or what area of the world they live in or areas of interest or who they are, whether they're a parent or a person with autism. Um, and then we're also very involved in what's known as, we mentioned, the Autism Brain Net. So we want people to connect with research in a way that they can understand. And so we help to communicate the importance of brain tissue research to the community, which is
Right.
really important because this is a very delicate topic. You're taking the brain of someone, which means this person has passed away. You're making
Mm-hmm.
an ask at a very, very emotional, delicate, difficult time, right? Because most times these deaths are not expected. They come out of the blue. And so there's an excellent, excellent, really amazing team at the Autism Brain Net that is there to help through every part of the process, from the time that a person wants to make a donation to shepherding through the donation process to making sure that brain can serve up to 50 research studies, and that the importance of the research is then communicated back to the community so that they understand this is a really important resource. It's a very difficult time. I know if one of my kids passed away, it would be the last thing I would think of, but it really is important. And we're trying to make it as easily accessible as possible because,
Mm-hmm.
there's been hundreds and hundreds of research studies using brain tissue, and that has been because people have put themselves out there and contacted the Autism Brain Net and made that decision, as well as the partnerships with things like medical examiners and organ procurement organizations, which are really important as well. But
Right.
it's really the autism community being actively engaged that's really pushed that forward.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm glad you brought that up because we've touched on sort of topics that might be off-putting, like living cadaver research, which is another
Yeah.
area that people don't like to think about, but it's needed and it occurs. And again, the fact that you have been involved in the Autism Brain Net, it's an important piece of this to really move things forward. So I really like that as well. Um, Alicia, I want to ask you just one other thing while we have you today, and I really do very much appreciate your time because I mentioned I saw some work in there in terms of the induced pluripotent stem cells and all that as important screening tools. You wrote an interesting paper in Frontiers in Psychiatry back in October 2023. It was entitled "Tempering Expectations: Considerations on the Current State of Stem Cell Therapy for Autism Treatment." And clearly the world of stem cells has sort of morphed and developed in all sorts of odd ways, everything from offshore clinics to sort of the minimally manipulated folks that want to sell you cord blood for every possible disease and everything in between. And now we have a lot of states in the United States that have these right to try laws. What's happening on this front? Because clearly, based on everything we're talking about, stuffing some stem cells in this extremely complex heterogeneous set of syndromes probably isn't the answer in the short term. And I'd love to just, how you respond currently to, folks that are out there that are desperate, that are interested still in, accessing these tools.
So I just want to make sure that everyone's clear on stem cells. So the first
Yeah.
thing is stem cell research. So
Right.
this could be anything from taking a little bit of skin, right, and then turning that piece of skin into
Right.
a brain cell, and then being able to understand how brain cells develop and connect and aggregate. And that is research that is still desperately needed because those come from people with autism. You can screen things with them. They're used for drug screening now. They're used for many different purposes. They're used to understand the basic biology of autism. So I don't want people to think that stem cell research is bad. It's really, really good. What we're very concerned about is the notion that you can take a stem cell, particularly from umbilical cord. So many people do this because it's been a proven therapy for cancer, right? Is
Right.
to save the umbilical cord blood, and it's processed down, and you pay a fee to collect it, then you pay a fee to store it, and then you pay a fee every year to keep it. To take those cells and then put them back into a person with autism, or take somebody else's stem cells, right? So take somebody's stem cells that doesn't have autism and like a sibling, and process those and then inject them in the same way that you would do in cancer, right? So this is a valid, I don't want people to think this is not a valid treatment for cancer. This is a valid treatment for cancer. It's important that if you want to store stem cells for cancer for future, that you should. But there's this notion that if you take these stem cells, right, which are found kind of in your blood, you process them down, that can turn into different types of cells, and then you put them back into someone that they're going to, number one, go into the brain, and then either repair or regenerate or correct the brain dysfunction that happens in some people with autism, right? So that's the contentious part. The really contentious part is that this is pretty dangerous. So I think that it's safe to say that when you are doing this in a medical facility that has, doctors and sterility, and it's for a life-threatening condition, that you're willing to take those risks. Is it worth the risk when it may be very dangerous? And I have talked to, for every parent out there who said stem cells have been miraculous for my child, and, there's many reasons for that. I've met parents that have said, this was really a horrible experience. We saw absolutely, my child had an adverse event. They developed rash, fever. We saw no improvement. We mortgaged our house. And we really don't know the safety of these things. Again, when we talk about life-threatening conditions, I think that we can all agree that, maybe the risks outweigh the benefits, but we're not talking about a life-threatening condition, and we're not even talking about something that's been proven. There's been a couple of studies out of Duke University that have looked at it and seen some differences, but in some groups and not other groups, and the data has been somewhat inconsistent. I'm not entirely sure that it's been so equivocal. I think that it's pretty safe to say that the data really don't show that it has much of an improvement. And I think more dangerously is people, because it's not, there are places, again, in the United States where there may be, you're right, different uses for these. Some of the stem cell companies have tried to open up clinics to do this. The reality is insurance is not going to pay for this. They're charging people $15,000 to $20,000 to do this. People are better suited to use that money for another purpose. It's not going to help their child. They're wasting their money. They can put that money towards a lot of different things. That can be anything from a special savings account, like the Works for College education, can be used to help with longer term care. It can be used to help supplement behavioral therapies. It can be used for, anything that is more evidence-based than stem cell therapy. So I worry about not just the physical safety, but the financial safety of families that are pursuing this, because there's really no evidence.
Got it. Perfect.
But stem cell research itself is not bad, and actually is incredibly important to better understand autism.
Yeah, and then again, coming back to the IPS work that you're doing, I think that's again, the ability to really, take anyone's cells, turn them into something, and then it's sort of individualized, the personalized understanding of different patients. Yeah, it's invaluable. So I'm excited to see that you're funding research in that area. So that's great. And yeah, Alycia, what's coming up? I mean, I know that you get out there on the conference circuit a lot, obviously to talk what's going on at ASF. What Anything else happening for 2025 in the coming months that we should know about? Other public facing initiatives, conferences, talks, anything else while we have you today, please.
Well, first thing on April 9th, the Autism Science Foundation has our Day of Learning. So this is an opportunity for the community to be, if you live in the New York area, we encourage you to go to our website and learn more and join us. So this year's focus is on technological advances. There is a stem cell study, not a treatment study, but a study looking at stem cells. We have an expert from Stanford talking about that. We have someone talking about using computer imaging and virtual technologies to help better identify autism at earlier ages. We have awards that are given to people in the community. We're happy to announce the Morris family, who's been very active in the Northeast region, is getting an award for that. And also tools for smartwatches that can help teachers in educational settings detect onset of an aggressive behavior so that they can detect what's going on based on heart rate and blood pressure through kind of like a smartwatch, and they can intervene before an aggressive episode even happens. So some of the interesting technology, I think you're going to see more of that. You're definitely going to see more drug therapies. So, and this includes gene therapies. So for those rare genetic disorders, right? The ones that there's a specific genetic variant in a specific gene, there's been a lot of activity around correcting that gene and focusing in on specific genetic therapies. And so whether or not they are going to be relevant for broader autism, we don't know yet. I think we're also focusing on making sure that everyone who wants one gets a genetic test, because that's really important. On July 25th, we will be participating in Genetic Testing Awareness Day. We will also be attending the International Society for Autism Research in early May this year. And I invite everyone who is interested to go to the Autism Science Foundation website and also the Autism BrainNet website, and I'll send you both of those links to get scientific, to not only participate in research, but to learn more about the research that's being done, and also things that people can do within their community to help autism research. I can't stress this enough. We are at a very critical and delicate time in scientific research, and we're already seeing things. We're already seeing the effects right now. People losing their jobs, scientific funding being halted, projects are being limited in scope. So we're definitely concerned about that, and also doing whatever we can to make sure that the effects are mitigated as much as possible.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, it's a very unique time, but again, I commend you for keeping all these programs going, and sort of the diversity of work that you're doing, and I really look forward to seeing how all this moves forward, and wishing the best with you and your team, shepherding these initiatives. Again, for everybody that is going to be listening to this episode on the various podcast networks, or who will be watching on the YouTube channel, you've been spending time with Dr. Alycia Halladay, Chief Science Officer, Autism Science Foundation, doing amazing work to fund scientific research, to understand the causes of autism, develop better treatments, and they say enable individuals to lead lives with dignity. Alycia, I want to thank you again for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us for a little while. Thank you for everything you do at ASF. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for so many people out there. Really an awesome story, and I wish you the best with it.
Thank you so much. This was such a delight. I wish that I had the interviewing skills that you do, because this has just been such a delight. So thank you so much.
I appreciate that. No, really great having